Hello, everyone. Welcome to the School of Cities Knowledge Café. My name is Brenna Keating, and I am the Research Officer for the School of Cities. Very happy to have everyone here with us today. The Knowledge Café at the School of Cities provides a monthly platform for faculty as well as students and researchers who are working to uncover solutions to creating a more just, sustainable, and prosperous city. This session is entitled Nurturing Indigenous Community Partnerships, and it is aimed at non-Indigenous people who seek to build relationships and community partnerships with Indigenous people for university-related and other types of projects. We are joined this afternoon by Professor Dani Kwan-Lafond and Isaac Crosby, who I will have the pleasure of introducing in just a moment. Before we get going, I think it's very important to acknowledge the land that we're on, and I'm going to give the floor to our comms officer, Ravish Amal, for our land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Brenna. Thank you, everyone. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and learn on this land. As we are gathered here today to learn about building respectful, intentional, and equitable partnerships with Indigenous communities, I, a settler, also want to nudge you to learn more about the land you're situated on and the actions we must undertake at our individual levels to fulfill our commitment to truth and reconciliation, and as a way of showing true intent to support the healing of people that have been most affected by the oppression of colonialism. We invite you to reflect on how your research and practice gives voice to the communities that have been historically marginalized and silenced. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Ravisha. Without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Dani Kwan-Lafond, who is Assistant Professor in Sociology at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. Her teaching and research interests include social inequality, Indigenous studies, race, racism, youth studies, and the sociology of education. Her approach to teaching and learning is informed by trauma-informed approaches to teaching Indigenous content and a focus on reflexivity and self-reflection for students. And to that end, her courses often involve guests, collaborators, and other hands-on activities that are designed to enhance students' understandings of difficult material. She was also formerly the coordinator of the Indigenous Studies Certificate Program at Centennial College, where she helped to create a free online e-textbook available to all learners in Canada. Professor Kwan-Lafond has also been an important associate of the School of Cities for several years. In 2020-21, she supervised a team of students in their multidisciplinary urban capstone project at the School of Cities, which was designed to explore how non-Indigenous organizations and Indigenous artists can create and sustain meaningful and equitable working relationships in a grants-based economy. The project was also a recipient under the 2020-21 School of Cities Anti-Black Racism, Black Lives, and Anti-Indigenous Racism, Indigenous Lives Funding Initiative. And they held a roundtable with Indigenous artists that was focused on exploring how they could change the art sector to center the well-being of Indigenous artists. And that roundtable actually happened nearly 1 year ago to the day, which I thought was interesting. Professor Kwan-Lafond holds a Master's of Education from OISE and a forthcoming PhD from York University. We are also joined today by Isaac Crosby, who will be speaking alongside Dani, and he is the lead horticulturalist at the Evergreen Brickworks and an expert in Indigenous agricultural techniques. He is one of 13 employees at the Brickworks who comprise the Indigenous Inclusion Working Group at Evergreen. The focus of that working group is to indigenize the brickworks through policy development, programs, as well as leadership. And he is also the Indigenous community partner on the UTSC Campus Farm, which I'm very excited to get to hear a little bit more about, I hope. Dani and Isaac are going to speak for 20 to 25 minutes. We're then going to open the floor to Q&A. And please, as Dani and Isaac are speaking, feel free to put any questions in the chat at any time. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Dani and Isaac.
Hi, good morning. Okay, so I'm going to do my screen share first and get that set up. All right. So today we're going to talk about the partnership that we have and how we've been working together. And this is just a quick overview of what we'll talk about today. So I'll do some introductions in terms of how I go about approaching people for partnerships and some guidelines. We'll tell you a little bit about the farm and what we've actually been doing there. And then I have some, brief information. It's not like a big lecture on this stuff, but these are important frameworks, I think, to keep in mind. So I will talk a little bit about informal learning and what that actually means. I will maybe call on Simon, who's one of our work study students on the farm, to tell you about how he did informal learning. And then I have 3 frameworks that I'm very briefly going to go over that really have to do with knowledge sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty, and data, and how to protect that and go about that work ethically. So let's start with, so you want an Indigenous community partner. And so I would encourage those of you who are thinking about that to think about the duration of the project. Is this long-term? I mean, I think of our farm project as like forever. Like it's as long as I can keep it going and as long as Isaac is willing to continue to work with us. But sometimes that work can be, what sometimes we criticize as transactional, right? Like it's a transaction. I'm paying you to come in and you're going to deliver some knowledge or a workshop or whatever. So to be very honest about that, if you're looking for a transaction, that's a different approach than trying to build a relationship and get to know each other. Is there cultural knowledge involved? So I should be very clear and say, I identify as non-Indigenous. I'm mixed race. I am part of the community through family, including children. And through adoption, but I want to be very clear that cultural knowledge is not something I should or would deliver. And I'm not from this territory. So I was born in Treaty 4 territory, which is Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. So part of the practice of my work is being very clear about whose boundaries I'm treading on and how to be very respectful of that, and making sure that the people who have cultural knowledge and are willing to share it are compensated fairly, are put in, safe kind of positions that honor their work. And so that is why in doing Indigenous studies work, I have to have partners. I have to have people who work with me because there are pieces of this that are just not my knowledge to share. The third point there is, if you're going to approach someone, to do your homework, essentially, know whose land you're on, know how to pronounce those words. If you're in this territory, know who the Anishinaabe are and who that nation is, who signed the treaties in this territory. This is all stuff you don't need to go to communities. You can do your Google homework and at least have something under your belt so that as you approach communities, you're not misrepresenting knowledge or unsure of how to pronounce language names or nation names, etc. And then think about who you know and how to build connections. So Isaac already works for UTSC, and then therefore now a number of other profs have approached Isaac because he's amazing and has knowledge to share. And so like those organic kind of connections make perfect sense. I had a similar connection to somebody that Isaac knows. And so at least I was able to be like, I know so-and-so, can I talk to you? Can you please talk to me? Because people are busy, and I think that there is also a very strong interest in Indigenous work in all institutions. So being mindful that people are being approached sometimes, from all angles and that can be unfair, overwhelming, so to be careful about that. So in terms of protocol, there are Indigenous protocols that go with different nations. In this particular territory, there's a gift of tobacco. And I would say for non-Indigenous people, I often get asked, like, how do I do that? And so my advice is do it, even if it's awkward, right? I think for anybody treading into someone else's culture and protocols, it can be awkward, but do it anyway, even though you feel awkward about it. The teaching that I have, and there are different teachings, is to gift tobacco or sema with the left hand. That's not consistent for everyone, but at least, and I would say, Isaac, maybe you can talk about how people do this, but like, I've never had someone be mad at me for doing it wrong. I've only had people be encouraging for good, effort done in a good way. thoughts on that, like protocol and approach?
Well, I always tell people when they're approaching me, approach me in a good way. Come, if you really want to get me on your side, come at me laughing, right? Come with that positive heart. Come with that good energy. So if you make a mistake and maybe you give it with your right hand, it's totally fine. It's totally fine. For us, it's the fact that you're taking that effort to do something, to learn something new. If you make a mistake, just don't get upset, don't get embarrassed, but allow us to correct you, right? Say, hey, next time, give it with your left hand, or maybe when you approach the person you're going to ask for help, if you're giving tobacco and they're going to be doing a program, maybe approach them at the beginning or beforehand, ask them, do you want the tobacco in the beginning or at the end of what we're doing, right? Most will say in the beginning to honor the tobacco, give the tobacco tie. Some will say, do it at the end, after when I'm done everything. So at least we know that everything's done. You can honor me with that gift at the end of it.
Awesome, thanks. The other things to think about, and Isaac can tell you whether I did a good job with these things or not, is just being really transparent. So when you bring in somebody as a partner, they are an equal partner. And I always say, I can write grants, I can show up on the farm and zero things would have grown because I have no idea how to do any of that part of it. And so we really are equal partners. And so I think it's really important to share with community members who are not in these institutions, how does payment work? When can they expect that payment? Who else is going to be involved? Are the students they work with Indigenous, in which case we're asking them to do mentorship. That's a different kind of teaching than working with non-Indigenous people. And so just being really upfront with any information that we have in terms of, institutional kind of back end stuff. And then the other thing to be transparent about is who benefits. So later in this talk, you'll see that I've pulled a lot of things that really come from the world of research and ethics, but that's because we're producing knowledge, right? We're documenting the work we do. You can see we've taken many pictures. There's a video that's been made. We're keeping notes and writing and learning from Isaac, learning Indigenous agricultural techniques. We're putting that down on paper. So we need to be very clear about where that information goes. This is resources for all of us and should enhance all of our work. It's not just, so that I can build a career or so the students can get some course credits. So thinking broadly about the benefit and really making sure that feeds back into the community, I think is a really, really important thing to remember.
It is. If I can just interrupt very quick. It's really great to, like what you said, about the transparency. You have to realize that a lot of Indigenous folks, a lot of us didn't have a chance to go to university or college. And sometimes when we're being asked to do work at these big places, we come with a little bit of fear. Because we're like, oh, okay, this is this is a big name. What's really going to happen? Are they going to use me for tokenism? Like, what's really going to happen here? And working with Dani has been amazing because she's been upfront since day one. There's been nothing hidden at all. She's been told everything's been upfront, transparent since day one. And I enjoy that. I like that because you know where you are and you know where you sit. And then with that, you can see the future where you're going to with it as well.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as a partner, it's the least we can do, right? Is to just share information honestly and in a good way, All right, I'll go to the next slide. So I'm going to show everybody this video. I'll mute myself for a sec while we do this. It's a 4-minute video that was made in June. So this is early days for our farm project. But it'll give you a sense of what the space looks like and the people who were working there. I'm not in the video because not my knowledge. And I think I was just away that day or whatever, but it was great because it really featured, the people who were really doing the heavy labor. So I'll play this and then we'll come back.
I want to take this time to give my respect, to give a land acknowledgement to the Indigenous people that were here before, that are here now, they'll be here in the future. So during this time when you're giving a land acknowledgement, it's about your own personal respect and honor of the people. So I honor and I respect the One Dot.
I honor and I respect the people of Six Nations. I honor and I respect the Anishinaabe Nation. I honor and respect the Batoon Nation. I honor and respect other Indigenous groups who have come down here, who live in Toronto or Toronto. This place, even though some people call it the meeting place, has always drawn us together in the past, in the present, in the future. So we must always take our time to give honor, to give respect to the Indigenous people that are here, that came before us, that will come here after us. Miigwech. So my name is Isaac Crosby. I come from the Ojibwa of Anderton, southwestern Ontario. I am here at the farm campus at Scarborough to mentor 2 youth in Indigenous agriculture. So what we're doing is building an Indigenous garden and Indigenous medicine garden, growing our 4 sacred medicines. The name of the project is Asst Gitigan, and what it is introducing Indigenous agricultural techniques at the farm campus at Scarborough, and also getting prepared for them to have their own medicine garden, where they will grow their own medicines for any of the elders that come down, where they have to give tobacco or sweetgrass or sage. At the same time, building a food medicine garden, which showcases the medicine of the 3 sister medicine mounds of corn, beans, and squash, also growing sunflowers and beans by themselves.
Tanse Alexis Bornick Deshinakashin. So hello, I'm Alexis Bornick. I'm an undergrad student, 2nd year, and I'm taking International Development Co-op Specialist program. I see it as like creating space for Indigenous knowledge and community for the students. Like eventually we'll be able to involve more Indigenous students on the project, and it's opening us up to land-based knowledge, which I think is really important because it connects all of us to our original form of education and learning. It's allowed me to feel connected to the university through my culture, and like growing up without my culture, I think it's been really important for me to like have this opportunity to learn this stuff.
So my name's Simon Reyes. I'm going into my 2nd year in September. I'm going to be studying sociology, and I'm thinking of also majoring in women and gender studies as well. My role and Alexis's role as well is to sort of just help make the project happen, and also to learn from Isaac. So we come in every Monday and Wednesday, and we water, we plant things, we weed things, and we actually like started all of this in the back that you see that wasn't there before, and we started making that happen.
This work is important to me because it's the ability to share knowledge. It's the ability to have people who are non-Indigenous and Indigenous come together and see the work that Indigenous people have done for thousands of years on this place called Turtle Island in this country called Canada. It's important to me to bring this knowledge back so that in the future when this farm is still here and other Indigenous students come down here, they will have some sort of connection to the land.
All right, so I'm gonna turn it over to Isaac to talk for the next few slides, which will really tell you more about what we're actually doing in the garden. Isaac, I'll change slides for you.
Awesome. All right, everyone. Well, you now know my name, Isaac Crosby. I come from the Anderton Ojibwe, so Ojibwe of Anderton for Southwest Ontario. So I'm here to talk to you about the UTS Indigenous Garden at the Campus Farm. This was our first year and has been the joy of my life this year to be able to go to this grounds and use the techniques that I grew up on. And to see, when you see these slides right here, you can see like the first one, you see the four container garden, the 4 containers or the containers inside there. We're actually using those on the garden to grow, well, wild strawberries, another great medicine, but also the 4 medicines, right? So sorry, 3 medicines. The 4th one being cedar, which has to come in. So this year, the year past, we grew prairie sage, we had tobacco growing, and we had sweetgrass growing as well. And the fun thing about those was teaching the youth and teaching Dani how each one of those grows in a different growing medium. Because most people think that you can grow sweetgrass and sage together. You can't. They need something different. Sweetgrass needs more damp soil, whereas sage needs dry soil. So there's a big difference, right? So what I did with that was introduce clay pot irrigation to the farm, which helped out with the sweetgrass, and we'll do it more. We will be doing it more again this year with other various things. You see, like the plants the plants that we brought there with the Three Sisters mounds. One thing you should know about me is that I love to push the envelope. If you tell me I can't do it, I'll show you that I can do it, and I'll send you an email and show you that I can actually do it. And I also like to bring back all the our traditional foods, right? So we have the traditional tobacco growing, right? Then we have in the middle right here, you have the different kind of squashes are going. So the white squashes are actually, they're scallop squashes, but they're actually the traditional Anishinaabe squashes. So those are like that genre of squash is thousands of years old, right? And that squash, they do not have at any of the grocery stores. So when they brought that back, people are like, well, what's that? I'm telling them the whole history of it. Well, this is something different. This is actually one of our traditional foods, along with the corn that we're growing there as well, right? So all that stuff we grew on site there, and we were allowed to we grew it to teach the story of the Three Sisters and to show the students how to grow this for future generations, okay? I mean, being there and seeing the Three Sisters mounds that we did there, if you were there in the very, very beginning and you saw like the first slide, the first picture you see there, before that there was the grass there and this ground that was so full of clay and stones that we had to dig in there and put up a fence. But we had to do Three Sisters mounds to showcase how we grew the gardens here on this land, right? And I wanted to make sure that we did them on the ground to show the traditional way of doing them. The ones we have here are actually mounds that are for a village that is going to be there maybe temporarily. And when you do bigger mounds, that means the village is going to be there for years to come. So hopefully we will be doing a bigger mound this year to show something different. But the Three Sisters mounds, people have to know that yes, there's corn, beans, and squash, but there's also different kinds of Three Sisters. There's the sunflower beans and squash, and there's sunchoke beans and squash, which are different ways of taking care of the soil that's underneath, that's growing the growing medium, correct? So growing these mounds and growing the Three Sisters mounds, I love doing this because it just showcased the companion planting of the three of them. And at the same time, you get these great crops. I mean, if you've never had succotash, which utilizes those three sisters together, try to find someone who's making succotash, or maybe you want to take the corn and grind it into cornmeal, learn how to lye the corn and use it properly and make cornbread out of it, proper cornbread, right? You can use everything in the Three Sisters mound to eat. And at the same time, those plants are medicines as well. So those plants have medicinal value as well within our diets, right? I mean, look like Sister Corn with her corn silk, because the corn silk is good for diuretics. I mean, it's good for stuff like that we use and we need to start using on a daily basis. I enjoyed this project. I will tell you this, I love how Dani and I met. Like online one day was a great way to meet, and we been friends ever since, right? Like she knew someone I knew, and I was like, cool, let's talk, let's meet, let's get together and plan this garden. And once planning that garden, once being there, I was like, wow, there's so much you can do in this garden spot at the University of Toronto when it comes to Indigenous gardening, Indigenous agricultural techniques to make the soil there better and to plant better crops that can actually be utilized at the university maybe they have a food club, maybe they have a drop-off center where they need a lot of beans. I mean, we can now grow these things on site at the University of Toronto, the Indigenous way of doing it, and feed the students. I mean, plus you get a lot of fun. I mean, working with the work study students. I mean, we had so much fun all the times we were there. We'd have our challenges. I mean, we did it. We had such a great time doing it, and we're going to do it again this year on a different scale, showcase something different, right? I mean, it's all for me when it comes to showcasing something different. I love planting everything the traditional way, but sometimes you got to do it the modern way. So hopefully this year we will be showing you how to do Three Sisters mounds in containers and showing how to do it differently so that everyone can actually grow these things either in their backyard, in the soil, or in containers.
Thank you. Yeah, and so I'm sure people always have like it turns into like a plant show. Like people are like, what, Isaac, I have this plant, what do I do? So feel free to ask Isaac all your questions or put them in the chat. I'm gonna go to just some frameworks that I wanted to review before we go to Q&A. So informal learning. So I think about a bunch of things, but I think about experiential learning, I think about informal learning, and I thought it'd be helpful to have a definition of that. So informal learning, I'm borrowing from Caladan, Cervantes, and Loomis, 2011. So 5 features. So 1, it's non-didactive. In other words, we go, we talk, we learn, just as we just did with Isaac in terms of, you know, like learning things that just come out because they're relevant in the moment, but we don't have there's no grand plan to generalize knowledge to, you know, so it's non-didactive. 2, it's collaborative, it's social, and it's cultural. And so both of those, right? So it's a lot of human interaction, you know, we're going back to cultural processes and frameworks and techniques that come directly from Isaac's ancestral knowledge. Mm-hmm. Also, informal learning is centered around a meaningful activity. So a really good example of informal learning is language learning, right? We learn language as small children, we learn it informally, but it definitely is meaningful. So gardening and food, similarly, is a really meaningful activity to do learning around. Number 4, ideally, the learner has an interest in the activity and they volunteered or they chose to be there. They want to learn this. It's not forced. And 5, there's no assessment. So I'm not grading, you know, Simon and Alexis at you watered those plants to, you know, at an A+ level. I mean, there's no, we're just learning for the joy of learning, right? So that is what informal learning is. Simon, I don't know if you're around over there, but I wonder if you would pop in and tell us just, yeah, what did you do and what did you learn informally on the farm?
I'm here. Yeah, I mean, with Isaac, it's really easy to learn informally because he just shares so much. I remember the first day we were all there together, he was like, you guys should bring a notebook next time. But yeah, I ended up learning how to make fertilizer. I know how to make Miracle-Gro at home. I learned how to make pesticides and all those kinds of things. And they're like, it's all very sustainable practices that he taught us in a way that just like, it just comes out of him because you're kind of already doing it, you know? So yeah, and I think, at least for me, it was important to learn those things, and I wanted to learn those things because like urban agriculture and community gardening is something that I want to try and make a career out of, hopefully. And learning how to do it sustainably and learning how people traditionally do it in a place where I'm not from and a place that I live in. I think that's pretty important. So yeah, I don't know what else to say.
No, that's great. I just wanted to get your perspective. I forgot that you learned all about fertilizing. Isaac taught us about fish and yeah. I'm not articulating that well. Yeah.
You all thought it smelled so bad. And I was born in a city next to the Pacific Ocean. So I was like, oh, this smells so good. You know? That's
great.
It was
so
fun.
Yes. So that's, you know, it's a perfect example of informal learning. It's also experiential learning, I feel the need to say. Experiential learning is hands-on learning, but we have a plan. So we also did have a plan. Like we want to very clearly know what is a Three Sisters garden, what are the medicines. So there are some things that, you know, we are learning through experience, and then the informal learning is kind of everything else. And yes, as Simon pointed out, I think one of the unique things about Isaac is that he's very generous with his knowledge. Yeah, and that's not everybody who is as giving, you know, to everybody. So we're just lucky.
Thank you. I give all my knowledge because I need all of us to be on the same page if we're going to take care of this earth.
Right. Okay, I have a couple more frameworks. I'm so happy to see there are questions in the chat. So I'm going to take maybe 5 more minutes to talk about a couple frameworks, and then we'll go to questions. So ethical issues to consider. So the reason that I think ethics have to be at the forefront of this kind of work in particular is because if we're dealing with relationships that involve Indigenous people, we are in a country that continues to practice colonization, that continues, this is not historical, so I put present day and historical, and I think both are kind of separate and different. And as Isaac hinted to at the beginning, many Indigenous people continue to be excluded from these institutions and have a really bad relationship, not the fault of Indigenous folks, but have a really poor relationship with these kinds of colonizing institutions. And so, we, as those of us who work here, have to be conscious that when we approach community, we're approaching it with the big colonial hat of this giant institution and all of its history as well. And so that is something to be very conscious that we represent that. And so I think that articulating our own sense of ethics is super, super important. So I'm going to share with you 3 frameworks that I find useful and have looked at. So OCAP principles. OCAP principles are actually developed by First Nations, which I'll talk about the limitations of that as well, but it thinks about data. So we're thinking about, this mostly applies to research, but again, we're documenting things. And so we're ending up with a body of media and documentation that we need to be very clear about where that goes, who gets to access it. And the more years that we work on this, the more of a body of kind of work we're going to have. So OCAP stands for ownership. And the key thing there is that data or information about Indigenous folks is collectively held. We tend to think about individual ownership because we're all westernized and colonized. But Indigenous communities talk about community and group ownership, which is a bit different. Control. So First Nations have the right to seek control over research and information that impacts them. Access. They have to be able to access it, obviously. And possession. So possession is about control, but it's about accessing it on the terms that people set. And so you can go to the website that I have linked there. Again, this is a First Nations tool, so it's particularly applicable. However, it also has some limitations. So First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are not all the same. And so it's important to note that this is a First Nations tool. It should include Métis and Inuit, but it does not yet. And that has to do with who developed the tool and how it's been, kind of funded and governed, I guess, or administered. Also, we assume often as, professors and academics that First Nations folks are going to know about these things. And so it's possible that you go to approach a community and they've never heard of the OCAP principles. And yet the OCAP principles are there to protect them. And so that's a disconnect that, we have to think about in terms of our work. So again, it's about transparency. And if you're working with an entire community, sharing with that community every bit of information that you have about how they can be protected and making sure that you're starting on the same page. Many institutions don't know about OCAP yet or are not using it. Fair data principles. So fair data, this is a non-Indigenous tool developed by a bunch of researchers, but it's a great tool and it thinks about data. So it's more oriented around like large scale data sets, but I wanted to mention it because I think it's related. So FAIR stands for findable. Data should be easily findable, accessible. It can always be obtained. Interestingly, FAIR principles apply to machines, like the functioning of data systems, as well as to human beings who access data. Interoperable, so using shared language so that information is cross-checkable and linkable, et cetera, and reusable. So the FAIR principles there's the website for it as well, something to consider if you're somebody who works with data sets. And then the CARE principles were a response to FAIR, because the FAIR principles didn't do at least didn't explicitly speak about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people. And so the CARE principles arrived later and did that. So I'm just going to read this because I think it's well put. So it says, the current movement toward open data and open science does not fully engage with Indigenous people's rights and interests. Existing principles within the open data movement, example FAIR, primarily focus on characteristics of data that will facilitate increased data sharing among entities while ignoring power differentials and historical contexts. The emphasis on greater data sharing alone creates a tension for Indigenous peoples who are also asserting greater control over the application and use of Indigenous data and Indigenous knowledge for collective benefit. So we can look at CARE really quickly and what the CARE principles are. So they are collective benefit. So whatever data you have should be used to improve the well-being of Indigenous life, Indigenous communities, etc. The authority to control, so that communities get to develop their own culturally appropriate, this is maybe the difference here between CARE and FAIR, that CARE is about culturally appropriate tools for how to oversee and control data. Responsible, so it's about relationships. So the CARE document talks about building relationships so that people have a good understanding of data and how it's used, and also that data represents and reflects Indigenous ways of knowing or Indigenous worldviews. And then finally, CARE has a more Indigenous focused ethics approach that looks at minimizing harm, Indigenous representation, like who are the researchers and are they Indigenous people? And then long-term planning. I've put 7 generations. It's an idea that resonates in this territory. But the idea being that you plan for the long term. So can you think about what will be the impact of this work in 7 generations down the line, particularly relevant to work around land and that kind of thing. And then finally, just a useful framework. I've borrowed this from my colleague, Shannon Winterstein, who does work in this area, thinking about knowledge sovereignty. So Indigenous knowledge is sovereign. It belongs to itself, which is a weird way for us to, Westernized thinkers to think about it. But I thought these 2 frameworks are interesting. And so a colonized way of thinking about it sees Indigenous people as historical relics. So, and often our own schooling in this country still tends to kind of pitch it that way. Indigenous folks as dependent and wards of the state. Also important in the green there, that whether we think about Indigenous people as having the same rights as everyone else, and I would say that Canadian multiculturalism tends to do this, where Indigenous folks get lumped in as one of many, and they are not. They are inherent rights holders, so that's very different from those of us who are covered under a constitution and charter of rights. And then Indigenous data sovereignty is not important. So if it's not being considered, that's a problem. And so a decolonized framework for this would look at Indigenous people as here and active. They are global actors and connected globally. The language that we use, so Indigenous as opposed to Aboriginal, right? We used to say that in Canada. Indigenous came with UNDRIP. So as Indigenous rights became more internationalized, we also changed our language. Indigenous folks have specific rights, so they are inherent rights holders and treaty signatories, and that is different from the rest of us. And Indigenous data sovereignty, is key to decolonization. We cannot talk about decolonization if Indigenous folks don't control, own, govern the data that is about them. So these are kind of larger frameworks that I think that we should be thinking about in this work. Thank you. We'll go to questions, but I just wanted to say that yes, the farm has grown organically, and so we're expanding this year. We're going to have volunteer Fridays, and Beatrice Lego is the farm coordinator, another person without whom, we could do nothing without Beatrice, and all of her guidance and partnership really is another equal partner here. So she's in charge of the farm and who comes to the farm. So if you're interested in volunteering, you can reach out to her. If you're interested in our particular project, you can reach out to me. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and then we can just go to questions. I have to open the chat, but I can see them there.
Thank you so much, Dani and Isaac. That was such a grounded, authentic, interesting discussion. I have so many questions, and I'm sure lots of other people in the discussion do as well. I especially really liked your discussion of just like being really honest and authentic and transparent when you are developing or attempting to develop Indigenous partnerships. I think there's often, a tendency to think, oh, we want or we need an Indigenous partner or partnership, but not necessarily knowing to what end, and not necessarily knowing exactly like in a really transparent way what that's going to look like and what we want that to look like. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to go into getting really clear and being able to be really transparent about what that means. And then I also think following through on what it is that we've said that we're going to do, what it is that we really set out to do within that partnership. It was so interesting to hear you talk about, speaking to, and I think it seems so intuitive, but I think it's really amazing that you brought it with such clarity to this discussion. The idea of, not just thinking about what are the more general cultural practices, but what does a specific person that I'm dealing with, what did they specifically want or need? And Isaac, you brought this up, like having that discussion with that person. Do you want the gift of tobacco before this project or after? And having those just really grounded, authentic discussions with those partnerships to make them seem real and to make it, something that's a real, that's something that can be fulfilling for everyone. I thought that was, just so interesting. And I really enjoyed the talk a lot. Maybe I'll just take the first question since I have so many, and then we can open the floor. I know lots of other people are already posting in the chat. I was thinking about, more generally what it means to have Indigenous, non-Indigenous partnerships. And then, you're centering your talk around this farm. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, and I think this question is for both of you, if you could talk a little bit about the importance of like agriculture and farming to creating collaborative Indigenous, non-Indigenous partnerships, and like what the meaning or the value of that particular space or that particular kind of activity is to creating those kinds of partnerships.
That sounds like an Isaac question.
All right. So this is what I tell people when I'm doing my talks and stuff like that. Because most people, rightfully so, in this country called Canada, want to learn Indigenous agricultural techniques, how we took care of this earth, how we took care of this land. So I always tell people this: what I would love you to do first of all is go research where the country you come from, how they took care of the land there. Learn that agricultural first. What you're going to find is that there's actually correlations between the Indigenous people here and where you're from. There's going to be certain things that we actually cross paths like this. And once you get that, and on top of that, you can build on your indigenous knowledge here, right? But I always make sure people go back and see what their ancestors are, because if you really think about it, none of us would be here without our ancestors being farmers or agriculturalists. We all come from an agricultural background. It's just that some of us kept the knowledge going, and some of us let the knowledge go so they can get other knowledge, right? So we all come from an agricultural background. So when it comes to me personally, centering all my stuff around agriculture and food, that's because deep down within our human psyche, within our human experience, it always comes back to food. And I always know that when you feed people, they will learn more, they will have more fun, and they will do more.
Yeah, I think the only thing I can add to that is to say that from an educator point of view, it's amazing how, we have deep discussions about colonization, food sovereignty, access to food in Scarborough, many things through this, the access point of planting some seeds, right? Mm-hmm. I also wanted to add, Isaac, that a very culturally relevant piece of this work that would not be the same without somebody like Isaac is we know the stories of all of those seeds. So, and I think about like, it's our citations, but I'm making a joke, but Isaac every seed that was brought in. We know what people gifted those seeds, who, the names of the people who, and so we can now carry that knowledge forward. And that is a different way of learning from, kind of Western, like you buy your envelope of carrot seeds at the Loblaws or whatever, right?
True.
Maybe I'll pass it off. So I'm just noticing Douglas was, I think, one of the first people to type a question in the chat. Douglas, did you want to ask your questions?
Oh, sure. First, I was just wondering, Dani and Isaac, like, how did you guys learn about farming or gardening practices yourselves? And then if one of you would maybe share about the Miracle Grow, that kind of piqued my interest. Thank you.
Go ahead, Isaac.
What, it's not a Dani question? Darn it. Okay. All right. So I am actually from a farm. I'm from Southwestern Ontario. I was born and raised on a farm. I'm a farmer by blood. So I grew up with my Indigenous great-grandparents and grandparents and mother. They all taught me farming. So on my mother's side, they were mostly farmers. On my father's side, they're Black and just like me. They were actually landscape horticulturalists that were Indigenous, that took care of all the land for all the rich people. So I learned all my techniques from my grandfathers, my great-grandfathers, my great-grandmothers. And I just, as time went on, learned new skills. Then when I was 40 years old, I went back to school to do landscape horticultural technician, to learn a little bit more about that. So what I wanted to do is make sure that I kept my traditional knowledge in my head, but learned the modern techniques as well. So that means going back to school, going to the colonial school and learning how they take care of things, and then taking them both and seeing how I can bridge them together. When it comes to the homemade Miracle Grow, I always get questions on that, because I always tell people, Miracle Grow, that blue stuff you buy in the store is not good for your gardens, for your plants, not good for you. So there's a homemade Miracle Grow version of it. So what I can do, I can do it really, really fast for you. So what you're going to need is 3.65 liters of water or 1 gallon of water. You're going to need 1 tablespoon of baking soda. You're going to need a half a tablespoon of Epsom salt. And then you're going to also need a half a teaspoon of household ammonia. Do not get industrial strength or else you destroy your garden. Get household, a half a teaspoon, add all that into the water, mix it up, and there's your homemade Miracle Grow. Your plants will love it. Give it to your plants once a month.
That is so cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I will say, I never learned about gardening. I grew up urban. Yeah. And so I have learned more in a year with Isaac than I have learned in my whole life.
I see that Carolina had a question around the specifics of where data is stored, Dani, that allows for shared ownership.
Yeah, so the end of the season last year, we set up for now a SharePoint that we all have access to. So we did like a photo dump and a dump of any videos we've got. So last year was our first season. So we kind of wrapped in September, October. And now this is the next phase. Like, we're thinking about, where do we store this? How do we make sure we all have access to this? When we're all making these kinds of presentations, like, this is all of our work, right? So what I don't want is this to be locked away in some kind of faculty, I don't know, something, So these are pieces that we're thinking about. We will have a forward-facing SharePoint as well that documents our work and has information for people who want to come and visit us. So it's in development, but very much will be, like, those of us who are on the farm will have total, like, shared access to those resources.
So we have another comment in the chat here. Archer is asking, what would be your suggestion for involving Indigenous community that does not involve research? In the programs I run, we don't have any Indigenous representation, and the first step would be to find and connect with community leaders. And there also seems to be a couple of questions about the specifics of tobacco, gifts of tobacco as well. Is that something you would do if you just reach out to connect with the community, or does that happen once you're actually working on a project? And also, where do you get tobacco from? And how would we find out where to get tobacco and the specifics around giving that?
So I can tell you, I can answer kind of 1 and 3, and I'll throw it back to Isaac for the specifics on the tobacco. so we're growing tobacco on the farm specifically because it's really hard to find traditional tobacco. Before we were growing it, I would either drive to Curve Lake, which is near Peterborough, or, you know, through people that I know. You can't get it, for example, at the Native Canadian Center. They have a store, but they don't carry traditional tobacco. So now you can contact us and we will share it if you need it. We have lots. And we've kept our seeds from last year. So we're gonna plant more. So if somebody needs a favor, we are happy to share what we've grown. Get in touch with us. Otherwise, the closest place to Toronto is Waitung Center, which is the store in Curve Lake. And then maybe I'll give you some suggestions with how to start thinking about including Indigenous folks, which is, first, there's a lot of homework to be done. So I would first look at, do you have money to compensate folks? Because you don't want to figure that out later. I had a meeting with a community organization a couple weeks ago, and they had a grant and were ready to launch a program, but we're like, oh, but we need, you know, an Indigenous person in X role. And so my answer to them, very kind of as nice as I could, was, well, then you're not ready to start a program. You need to sit down for a year and like sit with people and feed them. Like, as Isaac said, have meals to get to know each other. And if they're going to be part of your program, they need to come to that themselves. Like, they need to arrive at a place where they feel like they want to be part of your program. So it's a long, slow process. I guess what I'm trying to say is you have to create a relationship, you know, and that involves thinking about what resources do you have, what time do you have, and invite folks for conversations. Like, you know, respectfully ask people to sit down and share their thoughts with you before you ask them for a big thing like knowledge or time in a program. So it's slow, careful work, but that's because this is a community that has had so much harm done, right? So it has to be slow and careful, so that's my answer. That's my thought. Isaac, what do you want to offer thoughts on the tobacco offering?
Okay. I want to talk about engaging the Indigenous community, Indigenous people. What I find is that some people, and non-Indigenous people, still have some sort of fear towards us, or afraid of us to approach us and ask us to help out, or to be part of their programs or their system. My first thing is get rid of that fear. Get rid of that fear. If you know that your program needs to include Indigenous folks, you're going to want to approach them within your top 3 of whoever you're approaching. Don't leave it to the end. Get us there first, because you're going to have to develop this relationship with us, and it's going to be slow. I'm going to tell you that right now. It's going to take some time, because we're coming from a hurt past, right? And we're coming from, okay, you want my knowledge, but do you really see me? Okay. When it comes to tobacco, you also have to know that not everyone's going to take your tobacco. Some people are going to say, nope, not doing it. They will give you your tobacco back, or they won't take your tobacco. Please know that. There are some people who won't take it. Some people who will take it, yes, I will help you out. But make sure you come with good intentions, with a good heart, because like everybody else, we can sense it. We can sense what's up. We can sense when we're about to be tokenized. We can sense when it's about to go wrong. So come with an open, honest heart. And when you come with your tobacco, do your best not to buy tobacco from the store, the pipe tobacco, cigarette tobacco. Please do your best not to do that. If you're at University of Toronto Scarborough campus, come see us. We're growing it there for you, because that tobacco is grown by us. That tobacco has our energy and has our positive vibes in it. Whereas the stuff you get from the store, that's the pipe tobacco or cigarette tobacco, you don't know where it's coming from. At the same time, we already know what they already add to that tobacco. It's not pure tobacco anymore. Whereas the ones we're growing on site is pure tobacco. And that's it.
I think we can open the floor. We have 5 minutes left, so we probably have time for a few more questions.
I also know there are a couple of names here that I recognize who are also people who, I will not call you out, but you probably have some thoughts that you could also add to these questions. There are some pretty knowledgeable folks here.
Absolutely, happy to have anyone jump in.
Yes. It's all about sharing.
I was really interested in your discussion of informal learning. And I was wondering, Dani and Isaac, if you have any thoughts on how, formal institutions or, institutions that really prioritize formal learning, like the University of Toronto and many other secondary, post-secondary institutions, how they can, move towards incorporating more informal learning. I know there is often co-op programs and other kinds of experiential learning opportunities, but much of the university still very much prioritizes formal learning. And it seems to me, despite the fact that I've gone very far in the formal learning system, it seems to me like prioritizing informal experiences and really valuing them is such an important thing and would present a lot of opportunities for people to have different kinds of learning experiences. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, my thoughts on it are, my strategy for pushing it is what I, academic, like naming it, right? And being able to actually say, not just we're learning things, but here's a paper that, that kind of structures what we're learning. I think, yeah, we need to see that. And I think from the part of my brain that is a trained sociologist, right? Like, I like knowing that there's a theory behind what we're doing. It's not just, we're not just making it up as we go. But that allows us to say, I think a lot about the particularly like the culturally informed pieces that we're learning with Isaac, right? Like, so I'll give an example. In the fall, we did a planting day where we planted, and like people had never heard of this. And Isaac was like, yeah, we've been doing this for like forever. It's fine. It's going to work, guys. Like, we planted potatoes in the same bed as garlic. So put potatoes on the bottom, we tracked which ones we planted, and then garlic went on top. They're all growing together, that kind of thing. And then so thinking about, okay, we did that, but what did we really learn, and how do we articulate that back to the academic community? And so that's where I think, like, that's my role. I think about my role is to put on paper and to kind of theorize what we're actually doing so that I can speak back to the institution in language that it understands, right? Yeah, we are very, very already doing a lot of experiential education, especially at UT Scarborough. There's a ton of initiatives there and co-ops, and informal learning, I think, is separate and different, and we're not, or at least we're not articulating. For sure it's happening, but we're maybe not talking about it as much.
I just teach. I just educate. I don't see the difference between formal and informal learning. My whole goal is to make sure that whoever I'm teaching, I make sure I go through either they see it and they learn, they touch it and they learn, or they hear it and they learn, and try to incorporate all three whenever I'm doing my teachings with people.
I think we have time for one last quick question. And Lori just put one in the chat. It was something similar to what I was wondering about as well. So in terms of learning about First Nations, Inuit, or Métis culture, and Dani, you also referenced, wanting to learn about land and languages and things like that before we go into a partnership. Where should we be prioritizing? Like, what kind of resources should we be prioritizing when we go to do that learning?
I can maybe speak as a learner, and I just also wanted to thank Sean Kinsella for their answer there. Sean is, I'm just calling out, Director of 8th Fire, coolest job title ever, over at Centennial College, and super knowledgeable, and their work is really important. Okay, hey. So Lori, to answer your question, I think both. So, I don't think we want, like, I am not learning about treaties from people, because I think there's like history there, and so there's different pieces, but I would say never only from books. Like, I think Indigenous folks have learned, people that I know have learned never from books, and they know tons. That is not how I learn as an outsider, right? So I've read lots of books, but I think to do that in the absence of real people at a certain point is, you're missing something there. So, but I do think it's important to do your homework and to know something before you approach folks. Like, yeah, and so, an example is, and it's happened, like students who are just so excited to meet a residential school survivor that they start asking about their story, right? And that's not the kind of thing that is appropriate, or that, right, unless it's set up to, that way. So I think both. Yeah, and happy to make some recommendations, and other folks here can make recommendations.
Amazing. Well, we're at time. Thank you, Dani and Isaac, so much for taking the time to speak with us. I'm sure I can speak for a lot of people here. It was very enlightening and a lot of new information. So thank you so much. Please do everyone join us for the next session of the Knowledge Cafe. It's going to be coming up on March 23rd, and you can go to schoolofcities.com/events for more information about that and to register for our next Knowledge Cafe. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mama P.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. I'll see you guys soon.